Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson was born in Amherst, Massachusetts, December 10, 1830. She lived her life in solitude, rarely coming in contact with anyone outside of her family, and when she did, these people had a large impact on her poetry. Dickinson's poetry was also influenced by the 17th century England metaphysical poets and her Puritan upbringing. On May 15, 1886, Dickinson died, and it was upon her death that her family found her collection of 40 hand-bound volumes, totaling around 1,800 poems.
Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. Elements of Literature, 5th Course, pages 561 and 562. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of grazing grain, we passed the setting sun. Or rather he passed us, the dews drew quivering and chill. For only gossamer my gown, my tippet only toll. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice and the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. Meaning and theme. The meaning of this poem is that death is not something that should be feared, but welcomed instead. Also, that it is an eternity on the same loop. The main theme of this poem is mortality. This is because this poem is about Dickinson's attitude towards death and what she thinks her own will be like. Dickinson uses this poem to almost paint a picture of what she thinks her death will be like. Literary devices and movement. Irony and tone are the literary devices used in this poem. Dickinson creates irony in this poem by describing death as a joyful carriage ride and using a light-hearted and witty tone throughout the poem. Because I Could Not Stop for Death has many aspects of romanticism within it. First, there is the fact that death has been personified by being turned into a man driving a coach. Also, there are references to nature. For example, we pass the field of grazing grain. We pass the setting sun. My impression. Because I Could Not Stop for Death is written using a very uplifting tone. This made the poem very enjoyable to read despite the subject. Also, the way this poem shows death, with the children playing and the setting sun, makes me feel very unafraid of death. Poetry by Marianne Moore. Marianne Moore was born in St. Louis, Missouri, November 15, 1887. She was a school teacher, librarian, writer, and poet. Moore was recognized and honored greatly for her work. Some of the honors she received were the Bollingen Prize, the National Book Award, and the Pulitzer Prize. Moore died on February 5, 1972, in New York City. Poetry by Marianne Moore. Elements of Literature, 5th Course, pages 786 and 787. I too dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it after all a place for the genuine. Hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate, hair that can rise. If it must, these things are important not because a high-sounding interpretation can be put upon them, but because they are useful. When they become so derivative as to become unintelligible, the same thing may be said for all of us, that we do not admire what we cannot understand. The bat holding on upside down, or in quest of something to eat, elephants pushing, a wild horse taking a roll, a tireless wolf under a tree, the immovable critic twitching his skin like a horse that feels a flea, the baseball fan, the statistician, nor is it valid to discriminate against business documents and school books. All these phenomena are important. One must make a distinction, however, when dragged into prominence by half-poets. The result is not poetry, nor till the poets among us can be literist of imagination, above insolence and triviality, and can present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads in them, shall we have it in the meantime, if you demand on the one hand the raw material of poetry and all its rawness, and that which is on the other hand genuine, you are interested in poetry. Meaning and theme. The meaning of this poem is that poetry may be hard to understand. However, when you do find genuine poetry, the raw beauty and talent is amazing. The main theme of this poem is empathy. This is because Moore uses this poem to let us know she understands how we feel, because she, too, knows how it feels to have difficulties understanding poetry and how frustrating that can be. Literary devices and movement. Imagery is the literary device used in this poem. Moore creates many images throughout this poem of people and animals. She felt this was all that was needed to bring meaning to her poems. Poetry has many aspects of imagism within it. First, there is her use of clear, sharp language and words such as contempt, unintelligible, prominence, and insolence. Also, there is the use of imagery as she talks about hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate, hair that can rise, and the animals throughout the poem. My impression. Poetry is a poem that shows us that even though poetry can be difficult at times, it is still beautiful. The use of imagery within this poem helps to convey this meaning without it being too difficult to understand itself. The way this poem explains poetry makes me feel a little more comfortable and at ease reading it.